Okay, hello English literature students. This is an overview of tragedy as a genre. It will be specifically about Hamlet at some points, but we'll start at the beginning, which is ancient Greece and Athens in particular. So Athens is a city-state in Greece, and that's where tragedy as a dramatic genre emerges, is developed, reaches its height, possibly. And that we're talking about 500 to 400 BC, so it's a very long time ago. If you've been to a country that has some Roman or Greek ruins, you may well have seen the remains of an amphitheatre at which theatre would have been performed, open air, and the performers wore masks over their faces. There are various arguments for why this was. It could have projected their voices. You can see how many people could sit there. The entire population of the city would come to watch these plays. There are only 3 professional actors, so in these tragedies you only usually have 3 main roles, but there was also a chorus of citizens, so they were amateur local people who learnt and performed the role of chorus in the tragedies. So there are 3 characters. The first actor, the main character, was called the protagonist, which means, the first character. Antagonist was the second one. And the protagonists in Athenian tragedies had to be, always were, characters of noble status, usually often kings or sons of kings. But they also are characters with megalopsychia, greatness of soul. So what that means is they have to have lots and lots, they have to be admirable in certain ways. Okay, so to be a tragic hero, you've got to have something admirable about you, as well as this nobility. What happens to tragic heroes in the Athenian plays is they cannot escape their tragic fate, and that tragic fate is ominously foreshadowed from the beginning of the play. But alongside their tragic fate, they also themselves act in ways which prove disastrous. So you've got a culmination of these 2 things coming together. Fate's against them, but also they make rash, foolish, and wrong-headed decisions during the action of the play. And that can be linked to a fatal error of judgment that they make at some point, either before the play or during the play. And also hubris, which is excessive pride, it means. And you're living in a world where the gods rule everything. The gods are jealous, and the gods will punish you if you are too pleased with yourself or too happy with yourself. But significantly, the tragic hero recognises their errors at the play's climax, and they reach a state that Aristotle, who was the Greek theorist we usually talk about here, calls anagnorisis, a moment where they recognise what's happened and do recognise their own errors, and that's really significant for why they're heroes, tragic heroes. The plots of the Athenian plays were often based on the myths and legends of ancient Greece. They involve the gods punishing mortals. So the gods are playing an active role. The plays have what are called the 3 unities. That's unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. So there is real time on stage. Once the play starts, it runs through in real time. So if the play lasts an hour and a half on stage, we see the characters for an hour and a half. You can't cut time out, you can't zip forward, a month later, the next act starts. It doesn't work like that. They also only take place in the one location, often in front of a palace. And it's a unity of action. What that kind of means is no subplots. Just one plot all the way through. Everyone who comes in is involved with that plot. They have a calamitous outcome, and the word catastrophe was used to describe this by Aristotle. We now use it widely to describe lots of things, but it comes from this very specific literary term for what happens at the end of a tragedy, which is lots of death. And this causes, Aristotle claims, an emotional response in the audience. So this is to answer the question, why do we enjoy tragedy? What is its purpose? What is its effect on the audience? And Aristotle said what happens is when you watch a tragedy, you have these feelings of fear and pity, but they get purged. And that's what he describes as catharsis. All these negative emotions come out, and then you feel better afterwards. So Rome was the next sort of empire that followed the ancient Greeks. They conquered ancient Greece, but they always remained slightly in awe of ancient Greek culture, and lots of Roman literature was inspired by it and modelled on ancient Greek forms, and that's true for their theatre and particularly for their tragedy. So the Roman version of tragedy, how it was different to classical Athenian tragedy, was a bit more emphasis on the horrific and gruesome episodes of myth and legend. And the playwright that we know Shakespeare had read in translation, probably, was Seneca. And Seneca's tragic plots often had madness and often had ghosts. So you can see where we're going with that with Hamlet. Seneca, like lots of Romans, followed a philosophy called Stoicism. He was a Stoic. And what Stoicism suggested, very, very simply, is that one should follow reason over emotion. You can't change your fate, but you can accept it calmly. So Seneca's characters often suffer when they can't be stoical about things. So tragedy really doesn't come to England until the Renaissance. Before that, we have an English dramatic tradition, but it's really, mystery plays, medieval plays based on stories from the Bible. So it's in the Renaissance that there was a renewed interest and knowledge in Greek and Latin texts, particularly Greek. People had been able to carry on reading and writing Latin and understanding Latin, but Greek, knowledge of Greek and reading and writing Greek had really lost. And this is one of the things the Renaissance did. And once you could read the Greek, you could translate that, you could often see what the Roman writers were on about as well. So English writers and dramatists were looking to classical models for their work because the Greek and the Roman had this high cultural status. English tragedy was most influenced by Seneca because, as I suggested, Latin was more widely read. And probably it was also translated into English, so it's widely available, the Seneca plays. So the first, well, let's see what happened to tragedy when it started being used on the English stage. Unlike the classical models, it didn't follow the unities of time and place. So you can get much longer plots that cover weeks, months, and it doesn't cover unities of place either. You can have bits set in castles, on ships, in different countries. In Antony and Cleopatra, for example, we have scenes set in both Egypt and Rome. They included elements of comedy. So this was not very classical at all. Often had clown characters within a tragedy, and they also included developed subplots. So a bit, doing it their own way in England. There's a subgenre of tragedy called revenge tragedy, which is very popular in England. It was highly influenced by the Latin tragedies of Seneca. And so in revenge tragedy, a noble protagonist is driven to deceit and cunning in order to avenge a wrong. So I wouldn't want you to think Hamlet is the only play in which this is what happens. In many of these revenge tragedies, the revenger has to hide their desire for revenge and has to use deceitful plots to get their revenge. The character, the revenger, follows a moral code of vengeance, and a cycle of violent reprisals unfolds. Revenge tragedy is not suggesting revenge is a good idea by any means. It often shows how revenge is a terrible idea and it just leads to more and more violence. The final acts would consist of a public display of something which conceals a murderous plot and would conclude with the death of the main characters. So once again, whereas in Hamlet you have that duel, the duel between, it's not meant to be a duel, is it? Sorry, it's just a fencing match between Hamlet and Laertes. That disguises a murderous plot. And once again, Hamlet is not the only revenge tragedy that does that, and Shakespeare's influenced by the previous revenge tragedies that have that as their sort of climactic scene. Plot exposition is usually provided by a ghost. So the ghost will turn up and say, I got murdered in this terrible way, you now have to revenge me. You have a hesitating revenger, you have a very strong villain, strong in terms of character but also in terms of power. So many complex plots, so many characters plotting against one another. You often can have a play within a play, and you often have a suffering heroine who's makes you feel really sorry for her. That's a lovely clip, isn't it? I think that might be from Titus Andronicus, where there's a lot of blood. So when we think about Hamlet as a tragedy broadly, looking back to our Athenian model, it does have a noble protagonist. Hamlet is a prince of Denmark. Yes, he also acts in a way that proves disastrous, not only to himself, but to those who love him. We can make a list. There is a calamitous resolution. But most significantly, he does, before the end, recognize his mistakes and achieve anagnorisis. When he talks to Horatio about it's either the end now or the end will come. Yeah, and you get this calm acceptance that you've never seen in Hamlet before at the end. It's very influenced by Seneca. So we have scenes of madness. We have lots of scenes of madness, not just Hamlet, also Ophelia. We have a ghost who appears. We hear reports of the ghost, and we see the ghost twice. The philosophy of the play could also be seen to echo the ideals of Stoicism, particularly when Hamlet talks to Horatio. What he admires about Horatio is Horatio's Stoicism. Many of its plot developments and characters are typical of the revenge tragedy. That's the end. I'm not setting you an essay, don't worry.